people are very good with when there's something that's very, we'll say chronologically linked. So you have something and then a couple, maybe an hour later, 2 hours later, like, gosh, I don't feel so good. It must be that thing that I ate. But when it's 2 or 3 or 4 days later, we're not thinking about the cheese or the whatever it is, the tortilla with the whatever setting it off, where we see this uncoupling, like you were saying, with the endotoxin inhibitor and the endotoxin, and then it has this ability to systemically affect these pro-inflammatory pathways. What is the timeline for that? Because I think that that would be a huge clue for people to, even if you're keeping some sort of food journal, to be able to look back. Because gosh, if you ask me what I ate, we're recording. If you asked me what I ate on the weekend, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I wouldn't be able to tell you what I had on Saturday or Sunday, let's say. Yeah.
For anybody who's experiencing things like this, or things that seem like you can never put your finger on, like why is this happening? And you're trying to think like, well, I had a green smoothie this morning. Why do I feel horrible? But you're not thinking about what you had for dinner the night before.
Right.
It's like you said, it's hard to remember what you did 3 days ago. So the best thing you can do is keep a food, mood, and poop journal where you write down what you ate, how you're feeling, what are your symptoms, and how often are you pooping, because pooping is really important part of this equation. And then look for the patterns. You want to tease out the patterns. And what really trips people up when you're basically, and I talk about this in the book, like becoming intuitive about your eating, like knowing what is it that your body craves, how are you feeling while you eat, and how do you feel after you eat. But then that post-meal intuition can run a couple of days, right? Because something you ate on Sunday, if you have a food sensitivity, could be affecting you on Tuesday. And it could be also something you drank, so it doesn't only have to be the food, it could be the alcohol. But it's hard to recall these things. And the body is a big trickster, so it doesn't have to do the same thing every time. So that also trips people up because they think, well, I ate this a week ago and I felt fine, but then I ate it again this weekend and then I didn't feel so good. But that's where keeping a journal is really important, because then you can start to tease out. What you're teasing out is the pattern repetitions. Even if there are interruptions in the pattern, you also have to think that food sensitivities work in the level of thresholds. So it could be that you're okay with once a week exposure, but the minute you have a second exposure to that same food, you're not going to feel so great, because now your antibodies have been activated, and just getting that re-exposure is what then causes the symptoms. So it might be a threshold issue where you just have to get past that threshold of exposure. And certain foods, you might have that. Some foods have a very low threshold. For a celiac, they can't have any cross-contamination with wheat, or they're going to feel sick, and it can take them 2 weeks to recover from just a small exposure, small cross-contamination. But other people have a much higher tolerance level before that gets tripped up.
Yeah, and that continuum makes a lot of sense. Well, even in the context of a food allergy, which is separate and distinct from what we're talking about here. You can have a mild allergy, you can have an anaphylactic allergy, right? And then there's everything in between that that's on that continuum. And it's interesting. I think that that's very interesting too, because you can have sort of these subclinical activations where there's no symptoms that you can easily discern or distinguish.
Yeah.
Maybe one exposure is fine, but then 3 exposures in that same week is not so great. So that it's really about sussing out that pattern, because it could also be like the food combination, like the amount of the bolus, like how much you actually consumed.
Yeah. Also, how stressed you are when you ate
Right.
those foods. What else is happening in your life at that moment? Did you not get enough sleep? We know that like not getting a full night's rest is going to also increase inflammation. It's going to activate that inflammatory pathway. So it depends on what your baseline inflammation is at and what are the other triggers that are added on top of that.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about stress, because I think stress is sort of this nebulous term. I talk a lot about it in the context of perimenopausal women and being able to manage sort of the oscillating sex hormones and the changes in our concentrations of sex hormones as we navigate our 40s and our 50s. Talk about how stress, and we want to distinguish between eustress and distress, right? So good stress, bad stress,
Yeah.
how that can affect the microbiome.
Big effects. I mean, first of all, I call stress an attack on the gut because when you're stressed, it's charging up those catecholamines. And I'm just, when you mention a perimenopausal or menopausal woman, I always think of, and I know this is generalizing, that not everybody out there would be this, but a lot of perimenopausal women are going to have had kids, and the kids are maybe early teens. So, the household can be a bit stressful, then their hormones are starting to go out of whack. Their teens are going into puberty, they're going through perimenopause, and they're trying to do a lot of things, right? They're juggling maybe their professional life with being a mom, with also being a wife, and I know again, I'm stereotyping because there's a lot of different permutations in our world now of this, but it can be a very stressful time for a woman. And that raises your cortisol levels. And when your cortisol is high, it's also going to affect the makeup of the gut microbiome, and you can start seeing shifts. So now you've got high cortisol shifting the gut microbiome, you have high stress causing increase in gut permeability. A lot of times when there's high stress, you lose vagal tone. Vagus is probably the most important nerve in terms of controlling what's happening in the gut, the entire digestive system. It's the longest nerve in the body. They call it a cranial nerve. It originates from the brain and it innervates all the internal organs. And when you're stressed, you shut off that vagus. That vagus needs to be sending just kind of like pings every once in a while, just keeping the dial tone going down to the gut. And when people are in this chronic state of stress, their vagal tone drops. Now, you may not know, you're thinking, well, how do I know if my vagal tone is is down? Like, what does that mean? Well, but you do know things that happen in your body, like you lose your appetite. You feel like you have a pit in your stomach. When you eat, the food just sits there. It makes you feel sick. These are things that people experience when they're stressed. You get constipated, or you start feeling a bit moody, or you start feeling kind of low, down, depressed. These are all signs of low vagal tone as well, even weight gain, things like that, because the vagus also, from a top down, controls gut permeability. Just interesting because there's a lot of different controls on gut permeability. Obviously, locally in the gut, it's being affected by the makeup of the gut microbiome, exposure to antibiotics, exposure to sugar, artificial sweeteners, alcohol, all sorts of processed foods. But it's also being controlled from the top down through the vagus nerve. And that can really disrupt the system. So high cortisol, loss in vagal tone that leads to increased gut permeability, shifts in the gut microbiome that then make you less stress resilient.
And so how does that change behavior? So I know sometimes there's been and we can maybe talk about some of these rat studies where they've done fecal transplants and it's completely changed the behavior, even just the hunger drive, like their eating patterns and their drive. So if you're in this hypercortisolemic state, so you mentioned all of the food sits in your stomach like a brick. I always, the first time that I had a really big speaking event, I was so nervous. I thought I was going to throw up. Like I felt so this like
Yeah.
need to sort of evacuate, right? Either from the top or the bottom, right? So it's like I need to
Yeah.
go to the bathroom or I need to throw up, like that kind of very and in my case it was very acute. I was getting on stage in 5 or 10 minutes and I couldn't my throat was dry, like my mouth was dry, all the things. How does that hypercortisolemic state drive behavioral change? So when we have this high cortisol state, you mentioned that we start changing now the
Yeah.
maybe the composition or the activity or activation of certain bacteria in the gut. How does that now drive behavior change in the individual?
Well, it can either be top down or bottom up, in different directions. So high cortisol can also alter the ecosystem away that there's more yeast in the gut, and yeast is going to hijack the brain and make you crave sugar. Now, you might also, when you're stressed, want to go for that glass of wine once the kids are in bed, or once, the day
Mhm.
is, you're unwinding from the day, and that's more sugar for the brain, but also sugar for the gut. And what do stressed people do? They go for ice cream, they go for the comfort foods, the mashed potatoes, the chips.
Yep.
That's the late night cravings, and they just keep you in that vicious cycle.
And then you're selecting for those bacteria that
By
now
the
do,
by the
yeah,
foods that you eat,
yeah.
you're actually promoting those bacteria that are then keeping you locked in that state, which can be really difficult. Like, how do you dig yourself out of that
Mhm.
particular state and find a way out? And sometimes it just involves, you've got to get to that point where you don't stand it anymore. Like, you don't want to be that way anymore. And you might have to go through a couple of days of discomfort, especially if you're really high sugar craver, because you've got to battle those internal sugar cravings. But there's a lot of things that can be done. Like, I talk about switches in the book. Like, how do you deal with the late night cravings that we've all had? I'm guilty of that. Like, rating, even though I'm gluten free, I'll go for the gluten free cookies late at night. But how do you do it in a way that is healthier for you and for the brain? What I've learned is that the brain doesn't really want sugar. It just wants the sensation of sweet, in that moment. So it could be that you have a fruit instead, an orange or some berries, strawberries, and that's the substitute that's giving your brain, it's not as strong of a hit as grabbing that, bag of Oreo cookies or whatever, but it's giving your brain kind of what it needs. And then usually, when there's a lot of sugar cravings, I always go back to self-care. Because if you take a moment to, like what you were just describing, like you're feeling, you're about to go on stage, you're super nervous, your vagus nerve is shut off, you're feeling nauseous, feels like things are just going to reverse themselves. Like, what could you do in that moment? And this is for
I
any
usually
moment.
breathe. I usually breathe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say breathe. And
Hmm.
actually, what I teach people is to put one hand on the belly and one hand on the chest, and then take a breath, but let the breath originate from the hand that's on the belly first.
Oh, that's good for women because women are always sort of sucking in their stomachs, right?
They're
We always
always,
hold
and
our bellies. Yeah.
anytime I ask a patient to show me how they breathe, they usually, I mean, my camera's up, but they're usually like this. They'll go,
Yeah. It's the
and
upper,
their
it's all the
shoulders come
accessory
up,
muscles of
and
respiration. Yeah.
they're breathing all up here. But
Yeah.
that style of breathing will make you look good in a photo, but it's not gonna help you feel calm when you're feeling super stressed. You actually have to reverse it and breathe like a baby. 'Cause babies know how to breathe. They breathe with their bellies first. So big
Yeah.
inhale, the diaphragm, and then second part of the inhale is the chest, and then you reverse it on the way out. You exhale up here and exhale here. And I love using the hands on the body to teach people, because I think adding that extra sensation really helps people get embodied, like really anchor into your body, and just feel where the breath is supposed to be. Because when you breathe with your diaphragm, you're activating those stretch receptors in the lungs that then send a signal through the vagus nerve, activate the vagus nerve, and get you into more of that parasympathetic rest and relax and digest mode.